She didn't even look at me when she said it. After everything, after the sleepless nights caring for Grandpa Theodore, after the months of watching him fade away in that sterile hospital room in Millbrook General, after inheriting the one thing he treasured most, my sister, Clarissa, just pointed at the car in my driveway and burst out laughing. Seriously, Natalie, you're keeping that piece of junk? It's embarrassing the whole neighborhood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name's Natalie Cunningham, and from wherever you're watching this, stay with me. Have you ever been handed something precious by someone you loved, only to have your own family treat it like garbage? That rusted, beat-up sports car sitting in my driveway in Pinecrest Heights wasn't just metal and wheels to me. It was my grandfather's pride and joy, his weekend project, his escape from a world that had taken everything else from him. But to Clarissa, standing there in her pristine white Range Rover, designer sunglasses pushed up on her perfectly styled blonde hair, it was nothing more than an eyesore. I mean, look at it, she continued, her voice dripping with that condescending tone I'd heard my entire life. The paint is completely faded, there's rust everywhere, and is that duct tape holding the bumper on? God, Nat, you can't seriously drive that thing around town. What will people think? She gestured dramatically with her manicured nails, the same hands that had never changed a tire, never crawled under an engine, never spent a Saturday afternoon with Grandpa Theodore learning about carburetors and timing belts. I stood there on my front lawn, still wearing the black dress from the funeral 3 days earlier, watching my sister mock the only inheritance our grandfather had left me. While she got the house in Rosewood Estates, the investment portfolio, and the antique furniture collection, I got what everyone called Theodore's old racing car. Even our cousin Benjamin had smirked when the lawyer read that part of the will. Poor Natalie, stuck with the junkyard special. But here's what none of them knew, what none of them bothered to ask, what none of them cared to understand. Grandpa Theodore didn't just give me any old car. 2 weeks before he passed, when the morphine made him drift between consciousness and memory, he grabbed my hand with surprising strength and whispered something that made my blood run cold. Natalie, my dear girl, that car in the garage, it's not what they think it is. Promise me you'll keep it safe. Promise me you won't let them pressure you into selling it. There are papers hidden in the engine bay, papers that will change everything. I had nodded, thinking it was just the medication talking, just an old man's attachment to his hobby. But now, standing in my driveway, while Clarissa continued her verbal assault, those words echoed in my mind like a warning bell I should have heeded sooner. You know what, Nat? Clarissa said, pulling out her phone and snapping a photo of the car. When your sister thinks she hit the inheritance jackpot, it'll get so many likes. She was already typing, probably adding hashtags like family fail and junkyard special. That's when something inside me snapped. Not the explosive kind of snap that makes you scream and fight. The quiet kind. The dangerous kind. The kind that makes you stop trying to prove yourself to people who will never see your worth anyway. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and realized I was done. Done with her condescending remarks, done with being the family disappointment, done with letting her define what had value and what didn't. I said, "You're right. It's just an old car." Clarissa smiled triumphantly, thinking she'd won whatever game she thought we were playing. Finally, some sense. I know a guy who runs a scrapyard in Millfield. He'll probably give you a few hundred for the metal. Better than nothing, right? I nodded, watching her climb back into her Range Rover, already moving on to whatever social event or shopping trip filled her days. As she drove away, leaving a cloud of expensive perfume and judgment in her wake, I walked slowly toward the garage where Grandpa Theodore's car sat waiting. The afternoon sun caught the faded red paint, and for just a moment, I could see it the way he must have seen it 50 years ago. Not as junk, but as possibility. That night, I couldn't sleep. Clarissa's laughter kept echoing in my ears, mixing with Grandpa Theodore's whispered words about hidden papers. At 3 a.m, I finally gave up on sleep, threw on some old clothes, and walked out to the garage.
If there really were papers hidden in the engine bay, if there really was more to the story than anyone knew, I was going to find out. Because sometimes the things other people see as worthless turn out to be the most valuable of all.
Let me take you back to where this all began. Before the laughter, before the mockery, before I understood what I was really inheriting. I was 12 years old when I first met the car that would change my life. Grandpa Theodore had just moved in with us after Grandma Rose passed away, bringing with him a lifetime of stories and a mysterious vehicle hidden under a tarp in our garage in Willowbrook. "What's under there, Grandpa?" I'd ask that first Saturday morning, pointing at the covered shape that took up half our garage space. Mom had been complaining about it all week, saying we couldn't fit both cars inside anymore because of Theodore's old hobby. He'd smiled then, the way adults do when they're about to share a secret with a child. "That, my dear Natalie, is a 1973 beauty that's been with me longer than your grandmother was." His eyes had a distant look, the kind that comes with memories too precious to share easily. "Would you like to see her?" When he pulled back that dusty tarp, I gasped. Even at 12, even covered in dust and clearly needing work, the car was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Deep red paint peeked through the grime, sleek curves that seemed to flow like water, and a prancing horse logo on the steering wheel that made my heart race for reasons I couldn't explain. "Is it a race car?" I'd whispered, running my small fingers along the faded paint. "She was," he'd said softly. "Back in her day, she was something special. Raced her myself a few times in the early 80s at Riverside Track, one more than I lost." He paused, looking at the car with the kind of love usually reserved for family members. But that was a long time ago, before life got complicated. From that day forward, every weekend became car time. While Clarissa spent her Saturdays at dance class and shopping with Mom, I spent mine in the garage with Grandpa Theodore. He taught me how to change oil, how to read the engine like a book, how to listen for problems in the way it hummed. More importantly, he told me stories. "This car has been to places you wouldn't believe, Natalie," he'd say as we worked side by side, his weathered hands guiding mine as I learned to use a wrench. "It's seen racetracks across 3 states, won trophies that are probably gathering dust in someone's attic now, but it's also been my companion through the hardest times of my life." I learned that he'd bought the car in 1973, the same year he'd started his small construction business in Millbrook. "Spent every extra penny I had on her," he'd chuckle. "Your grandmother thought I was crazy." "Theodore," she'd say, "we could use that money for the house, for the kids." But sometimes a man needs something that's just his, you know? Something that reminds him of who he was before the world told him who he had to be. The family never understood. Dad would roll his eyes when he walked through the garage, muttering about expensive toys and wasted space. Mom constantly suggested that Grandpa sell it to help with medical bills or home repairs. Even teenage Clarissa would complain about the smell of motor oil and the noise when we started the engine for our monthly test drives. "Why doesn't anyone else see how special she is?" I'd ask one afternoon when I was 15, frustrated after another family dinner where everyone had made jokes about the garage ornament. Grandpa had stopped what he was doing and looked at me with serious eyes. "Because they've never learned to see past the surface, sweetheart. They look at this car and see rust, see expense, see something old that doesn't fit into their modern world. But you and I? We see history. We see craftsmanship. We see a time when things were built to last, built with passion, built to mean something." He paused, wiping his hands on an old rag. "Someday, Natalie, people will understand what we've been taking care of all these years. But until then, it's up to us to keep her secrets safe." I thought I knew what he meant. I thought he was talking about the memories, the sentimental value, the bond between a man and his machine. I thought the secrets were just the stories he had shared with me over the years, the victories and adventures that had made this car precious to him. But as I stood in that garage now, 7 years later, staring at the same faded red paint and remembering Clarissa's cruel laughter, I realized that maybe Grandpa Theodore had been trying to tell me something much more literal, something about papers hidden in the engine bay, something that would change everything. And for the first time in my life, I was about to discover that the foundation of trust he'd built with me was about to become the key to something none of us had ever imagined. Those weekend garage sessions turned into something much bigger as I grew older. By the time I was 16, I wasn't just learning about cars, I was becoming Grandpa Theodore's primary caretaker, his companion, his connection to a world that seemed to be moving faster than he could follow along. While Clarissa spent her Saturdays at dance class and shopping with Mom, I spent mine driving Grandpa to his doctor's appointments in Riverside Medical Center.
The car became our shared project, but it also became our shared burden. Every month, I'd use my part-time job money from the local bookstore to buy parts we needed. A new battery here, replacement brake pads there, special oil that cost more than my weekly groceries. When other kids my age were saving for prom dresses or spring break trips, I was researching vintage automotive suppliers and learning about carburetor rebuild kits. "You don't have to do this, sweetheart," Grandpa would say whenever I'd come home with another carefully researched part. "This old girl has already given me more joy than I deserved. Maybe it's time to let her rest." But I couldn't. Every time I looked at that car, I saw the spark in his eyes when we'd successfully completed another repair. I saw the way his hands steadied when he held the steering wheel, how the tremor from his medication seemed to disappear when he talked about timing belts and engine compression. The car wasn't just his passion project, it was keeping him alive, keeping him connected to who he'd been before age and illness started taking pieces of him away. College became a battleground because of my choices. While Clarissa got accepted to Stanford with Dad's enthusiastic support, I chose Millbrook Community College so I could stay close to Grandpa. The family dinners that followed were brutal. "Natalie's wasting her potential," Clarissa would announce over Sunday roast, as if I wasn't sitting right there. She could have gotten into State University easily, but instead she's playing mechanic with a car that's probably worth less than her textbooks. Mom would nod sympathetically. "It's sweet that you want to help your grandfather, honey, but you have to think about your own future. Theodore would understand if you wanted to pursue your own dreams." What they didn't understand was that this was my dream. Not the car specifically, but the way it connected me to something real, something with history and meaning. While Clarissa studied business management and talked about networking and career advancement, I was learning skills that felt permanent, valuable in a way that went beyond quarterly profit reports. The medical bills started piling up when I turned 20. Grandpa's heart condition worsened, requiring specialized treatments that Medicare only partially covered. Without hesitation, I took out a student loan, not for my education, but to help cover his medical expenses. $15,000 that I signed for in the financial aid office, money that went straight to Riverside Medical Center and the team of cardiologists keeping him alive. "I can't let you do this, sweetheart," he'd protested when I told him about the loan. "That money should be for your future, not for keeping an old man breathing a little longer." But I'd already decided. "Grandpa, you kept that car running for 40 years because it mattered to you. Now, I'm going to keep you running because you matter to me." Clarissa found out about the loan 6 months later during one of her rare visits home. She'd been going through some mail that had been delivered to the wrong address and saw the student loan paperwork. The confrontation happened right there in the living room, with Grandpa resting in his chair just 15 feet away. "Are you completely insane?" she'd hissed at me, waving the papers like evidence of some crime. "You took out $15,000 for his medical bills? Natalie, he's 83 years old. This is what Medicare and savings are for, not student loans that you'll be paying off for the next decade." I tried to explain, tried to make her understand that the money wasn't the point, that keeping him comfortable, keeping him hopeful, keeping him connected to the things he loved, That was worth more than any career advancement or financial security. But she'd looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "You're enabling him," she'd said finally. "Enabling this fantasy that he can keep that car forever, that he can keep avoiding reality. And now you're going into debt for it? This is why I moved to Rosewood Heights, Nat. This is why I built my own life instead of getting trapped in other people's problems." The worst part wasn't her words. It was the way Grandpa's face had changed during her rant. The way his shoulders slumped. The way his hands trembled a little more as he gripped his coffee mug. He'd heard every word, and I could see him beginning to believe that maybe he really was a burden. Maybe the car really was just an expensive delusion. After Clarissa left that day, I found him sitting in the garage, staring at the covered car with tears in his eyes. "Maybe she's right," he'd whispered. "Maybe I should sell it. Use the money to pay you back, help with the medical bills. It's just metal and rubber anyway." That was the moment I realized how deep the pattern had become. For years, I'd been fighting a war on two fronts, trying to preserve something beautiful and meaningful while everyone around me treated it like a burden. My family saw my dedication as waste, my financial sacrifices as foolishness, my love for an old man and his car as some kind of character flaw that proved I'd never amount to anything. But I'd made my choice long ago. Every dollar spent, every weekend given, every sacrifice made wasn't just about keeping a car running or keeping an old man happy. It was about proving that some things in this world still had value beyond their price tag. Some relationships still mattered more than convenience. Some promises still meant something, even when keeping them cost everything.
I just never imagined that all those years of investment, all that faith in something everyone else saw as worthless, would turn out to be the most valuable education I'd ever received. The breaking point came on a gray Tuesday morning in November, exactly 1 week after we'd buried Grandpa Theodore. I was sitting in the law office of Henderson and Associates on Maple Street, still wearing the same black pantsuit I'd worn to the funeral, listening to Mr. Henderson read through the will with his practiced, emotionless voice. The reading had been delayed because Clarissa was flying back from a business conference in Denver, and she'd insisted we couldn't proceed without her being present. "To my granddaughter, Clarissa Marie Cunningham," Mr. Henderson continued, "I leave my house at 847 Rosewood Drive, including all furnishings, my investment portfolio currently valued at approximately $340,000, and my collection of antique furniture." Clarissa smiled and squeezed her husband Bradley's hand. She'd married him 6 months earlier in a lavish ceremony that Grandpa had been too weak to attend, though he'd insisted on contributing $5,000 toward the reception costs. "To my grandson, Benjamin Theodore Walsh," the lawyer continued, "I leave my workshop tools, my coin collection, and the sum of $25,000 to be distributed upon completion of his engineering degree." Our cousin Benjamin nodded respectfully from across the mahogany table. He'd visited Grandpa exactly twice in the past 5 years, both times asking for money for textbooks or rent. I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, watching my family members receive tangible proof of Grandpa's love. The house where I'd spent countless afternoons, the investments I'd helped him organize when his eyesight started failing, the furniture I'd helped him refinish during those long Saturday projects when Clarissa was too busy with her social calendar. "And finally," Mr. Henderson said, his voice taking on a slightly apologetic tone, "to my granddaughter, Natalie Rose Cunningham, I leave my 1973 automobile, currently stored in the garage at 847 Rosewood Drive, along with all related documentation, spare parts, and personal effects contained within said vehicle." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel Clarissa's eyes boring into me from across the table, could practically hear her mental calculations about how unfair the distribution was. Bradley cleared his throat uncomfortably. Benjamin shifted in his chair and muttered something under his breath about classic cars being expensive to maintain. But it was what happened after the reading that finally broke something inside me. As we walked out to the parking lot, Clarissa pulled me aside while the others got into their cars. "Well, that was awkward,"
I mean, I feel bad for you, Nat. After everything you did for him, all those years of playing nurse and mechanic, and you get stuck with that rusty old piece of junk. She laughed, actually laughed, as if my inheritance was some kind of cosmic joke. What are you going to do with it? You can't afford to restore it properly, and it's taking up space in the garage of my house now. Her house. The house where I'd spent 7 years taking care of our grandfather, where I'd cooked his meals and managed his medications and held his hand during the bad nights when his heart condition kept him awake. Now it was just her house, and the car, the one thing Grandpa had specifically chosen to leave me, was an inconvenience taking up space in the garage. I guess you'll have to get it towed to a storage unit or something, though honestly, the towing costs might be more than the car is worth. There's a salvage yard in Millfield that might take it off your hands for scrap. Probably get a few $100s for the metal. That's when the dam burst. Not with tears or shouting, but with the cold, crystalline clarity that cut through years of accumulated hurt and disappointment. Standing there in the parking lot of Henderson and Associates, watching my family members treat my inheritance like garbage disposal problem, I finally understood what Grandpa Theodore had been trying to tell me all those years. This wasn't about the car. This had never been about the car. This was about respect, about value, about understanding that some things couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. For 7 years, I'd watched my family treat both Grandpa and his passions like burdens to be endured rather than treasures to be cherished. Now they were doing the same thing to me. "You know what, Clarissa?" I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "You're probably right. It's probably just an old car taking up space." She smiled, thinking she'd convinced me to see reason. "Exactly. And think about it. Now you can focus on your own life instead of being tied down by someone else's hobby. Maybe use whatever money you get from scrapping it to pay down those student loans you took out." The student loans I took out to keep our grandfather alive while she was building her career and planning her wedding. The medical bills I helped cover while she was buying her condo in Rosewood Heights and taking European vacations with Bradley. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I just nodded and agreed that yes, it was probably time to let go of the past and move forward.
What I didn't tell her was that I'd already decided to honor Grandpa's final request. 3 days earlier, while sitting beside his hospital bed during his last coherent moments, he'd grabbed my hand with surprising strength and made me promise something. "The papers, Natalie," he'd whispered, his eyes more focused than they'd been in weeks. "Behind the glove compartment, there's a hidden panel, documents that prove she's not what everyone thinks she is. Promise me you'll look. Promise me you'll understand why I'm leaving her to you." I'd promised, thinking he was just confused, that the medication was making him paranoid. But now, standing in that parking lot while Clarissa planned the disposal of his most precious possession, I realized that maybe Grandpa Theodore had been more lucid than any of us understood. That night, I drove to the house that was no longer mine and sat in the garage with the car that everyone thought was worthless. For the first time since the funeral, I was completely alone with my inheritance, with my grief, and with the growing certainty that everything I thought I knew about my family was about to change. I pulled back the dusty tarp and stared at the faded red paint, at the prancing horse emblem on the steering wheel, at the car that had been the center of so many precious memories. Tomorrow, I would start looking for those hidden papers. Tomorrow, I would find out what Grandpa Theodore had been trying to protect all these years. But tonight, I just sat in the passenger seat and let myself cry for the man who'd seen value in things everyone else dismissed, who'd chosen to trust me with secrets I was only beginning to understand. I waited until Friday evening, 3 days after my conversation with Clarissa in the parking lot. She'd given me until the weekend to figure out what to do with that eyesore, and I wanted to make sure she and Bradley were safely tucked away at their weekly dinner party in downtown Millbrook before I started my investigation. The house felt different now that it legally belonged to her, colder somehow, despite being the same place where Grandpa and I had shared thousands of conversations. The garage was exactly as we'd left it, tools hanging in their designated spots on the pegboard, oil stains marking decades of weekend projects, and the car sitting under its protective tarp like a sleeping giant.
I'd brought a flashlight, a small toolkit, and a strange sense of anticipation that I couldn't quite explain. If Grandpa Theodore had hidden something behind the glove compartment after 43 years of ownership, it had to be important. Getting into the car felt like stepping back in time. The familiar scent of aged leather and motor oil, the way the driver's seat had molded to Grandpa's frame over the decades, the dashboard that I'd helped him polish countless Saturday afternoons. But this time, instead of reminiscing, I was hunting for secrets. The glove compartment was locked, which I'd never noticed before. We'd never had reason to open it during our maintenance sessions. Using a small screwdriver from the toolkit, I carefully worked at the mechanism until it clicked open. Inside were the usual suspects: owner's manual, insurance papers dating back to 1985, a few maintenance receipts and registration documents showing the car's progression through different states before Grandpa had settled in Millbrook. But as I felt around the edges of the compartment, my fingers found something unusual. A slight gap along the back panel, almost invisible unless you were specifically looking for it. Pressing gently, I felt the panel give way, revealing a hidden space behind the regular glove compartment. What I pulled out changed everything. First was a manila envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with tape that had long since lost its adhesive properties. Inside were documents that made my hands shake as I read them by flashlight. The original purchase receipt from Antonio's Classic Motors in Newark dated March 15, 1973. But it wasn't the date that made me gasp, it was the description and price. 1973 Ferrari 246 GT Dino Rosso Corsa Red VIN 06852, original purchase price $14,500. Ferrari. The word hit me like a physical blow. I'd spent 7 years working on a Ferrari, not just any old sports car, not some weekend hobby project, but an actual Ferrari Dino. The prancing horse emblem on the steering wheel wasn't some aftermarket decoration, it was original. This was a genuine, factory-produced Ferrari Dino, and I'd been too young and too trusting to recognize what I was looking at. The next document made my heart race even faster. An appraisal report from Hartwell Automotive Authentication, dated just 6 months ago. Grandpa must have had it evaluated during one of his doctor's visits that I'd driven him to, probably while I was in the waiting room reading magazines and assuming he was just getting another prescription refilled. Vehicle condition, excellent original paint, numbers matching engine, complete documentation, minor cosmetic restoration needed. Current market value, $1.8 to $2 million. Note, this particular model represents one of only 2,487 units produced, making it extremely rare in today's collector market. $2 million. I read the number 3 times before it sunk in. The piece of junk that Clarissa wanted me to scrap for a few $100s was worth more than most people's houses, more than the investment portfolio she'd inherited, more than anything our family had ever owned. But there was more in the envelope. A letter in Grandpa's careful handwriting dated 2 weeks before his death.
My dearest Natalie, if you're reading this, then you found what I've been protecting all these years. This car isn't just a car. It's your future, your freedom, your proof that value isn't always visible to those who refuse to look carefully. I bought her in 1973 when I was young and foolish and thought I could race professionally. Life had other plans, but she stayed with me through everything. I never told the family what she really was because I knew what would happen. They would have pressured me to sell, to be practical, to turn something beautiful into just another number in a bank account. But you understood her worth without knowing her price. You saw beauty where others saw burden. You invested your time and money and love into something everyone else dismissed. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are and who you'll become. The authentication papers are all there. Everything is legal and documented. She's yours now, completely and forever. Do with her what your heart tells you is right. Love, Grandpa Theodore. I sat in that garage for 2 hours, holding those papers and trying to process what they meant. Every weekend I'd spent learning about engines, every dollar I'd contributed for parts, every family dinner where I'd been mocked for caring about an old car, it had all been leading to this moment. The irony was almost too perfect.
While Clarissa had inherited what she thought was the valuable part of Grandpa's estate, I'd been given something worth more than everything else combined. The house, the investment portfolio, the antique furniture, none of it came close to the value of what was sitting right here in the garage, covered by a dusty tarp and dismissed as junk. But as the shock wore off, something else settled in. This wasn't just about money. This was about vindication. About proof that the things everyone had criticized me for, my dedication, my sacrifice, my refusal to see the car as a burden, had been right all along. Grandpa Theodore knew what he was doing when he chose me as the inheritor. He'd been testing all of us for years, watching how we treated something precious disguised as something worthless. I carefully folded the papers and put them back in their hiding place. Tomorrow, I would need to call Hartwell Automotive Authentication to verify everything. I would need to find a secure storage facility and proper insurance. I would need to figure out how to tell my family that their assumptions about value and worth had been catastrophically wrong. But tonight, I just sat in the driver's seat of my Ferrari Dino and smiled in the darkness because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the family disappointment who'd wasted her potential on an useless old man in his junk car. I was the granddaughter who inherited a fortune by learning to see treasure where everyone else saw trash. And tomorrow, the real education was about to begin. Monday morning, I called in sick to my job at Riverside Community Library and spent the day making phone calls that would change everything. The first call was to Hartwell Automotive Authentication in Chicago, where a specialist named Dr. Marcus Whitfield confirmed what the documents had already told me. Yes, the appraisal was legitimate. Yes, the car was exactly what the paperwork claimed. And yes, in the current collector market, I was looking at a conservative estimate of $2 million, possibly more at auction. Miss Cunningham, Dr. Whitfield said, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who genuinely loved rare automobiles. Your grandfather was sitting on one of the most sought-after Ferraris in existence. The 246 GT Dino is considered the holy grail for collectors. The fact that it's been maintained in private hands with complete documentation and matching numbers, honestly, you could probably get closer to $2.5 million if you took it to Barrett Jackson or Bonhams. Barrett Jackson, Bonhams. Names I'd never heard before, but that suddenly represented possibilities I'd never imagined. After hanging up, I sat in my small apartment on Elm Street, staring at the business card Dr. Whitfield had asked me to photograph and email to him. Everything was real. Everything was documented. Everything was mine. The second call was to my insurance agent, Janet Morrison, at Millbrook General Insurance. That conversation was surreal in a completely different way. I need to add a vehicle to my policy, I said, trying to keep my voice casual. Of course, honey. What kind of car are we talking about? Year, make, model? It's a 1973 Ferrari 246 GT Dino, and I need it insured for $2.2 million. The silence that followed lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Janet's voice came back, careful and professional. Natalie, I'm going to need to transfer you to our specialty vehicle department. This is a bit outside my usual coverage area. 3 hours and 4 phone calls later, I had a temporary insurance policy that cost more per month than my rent. But it also meant that my inheritance was officially protected, legally documented, and ready to be moved to a secure facility.
That's when I made the call that would really set everything in motion. Clarissa had been texting me all weekend, increasingly impatient messages about clearing out the garage and being realistic about timelines. Her latest message, received while I was on hold with the insurance company, had been particularly cutting. Nat, I know you're sentimental about the car, but I've got potential buyers coming to look at the house this week. The garage needs to be cleaned out. I've already called Morrison's Towing in Millfield. They can pick it up Thursday and pay you $400 cash for the scrap. Morrison's Towing? $400? For a Ferrari worth millions. I called her back immediately.
Clarissa, it's Natalie. I got your message about the towing company. Oh, good, she said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. I was starting to worry you were getting too attached. I know it's hard to let go of things that remind us of Grandpa, but honestly, this is for the best. You can't afford to maintain something like that, and it's just going to be a financial drain. Actually, I said, keeping my voice steady, I've decided not to scrap it. I'm moving it to a storage facility instead. Storage? Her tone shifted immediately. Natalie, that's going to cost you hundreds of dollars a month. For what? It's not like you can afford to restore it properly. Be practical here. I've already arranged for specialty transport and climate-controlled storage. The car will be moved Wednesday morning. Specialty transport? Now she sounded annoyed. What kind of specialty transport? Natalie, you're being ridiculous. It's an old car, not the crown jewels. That's when I decided to drop the first hint. Clarissa, have you ever actually looked at the car? I mean, really looked at it? What do you mean? It's old, it's rusty, it takes up space. What else is there to look at? The badge on the steering wheel. The emblem on the hood. Did you ever notice what kind of car it actually is? A pause stretched so long I started to wonder if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice had a strange quality to it, like she was trying to convince herself of something. That can't be right. Natalie, Ferraris are expensive cars, rich people cars. Grandpa was a construction worker. There's no way he could have afforded a real Ferrari. He bought it in 1973 for $14,500. I have the original purchase receipt. Even if that's true, she said quickly, vintage cars are only worth something if they're in perfect condition. That thing has been sitting in a garage for decades. It probably needs a complete engine rebuild, new paint, new everything. The restoration cost would be more than it's worth. But I could hear something new in her voice now. Uncertainty. The first crack in her absolute confidence that she'd gotten the valuable inheritance while I'd been stuck with worthless junk. Actually, I said, savoring the moment, I had it appraised. Professional authentication, full documentation review, current market analysis. Appraised? Her voice rose slightly. By who? Some local mechanic? Hartwell Automotive Authentication in Chicago. They specialize in rare and vintage vehicles. And what did they say? The question came out almost as a whisper. They said it's worth between $1.8 and $2.2 million in its current condition. The phone went completely silent. Not the silence of someone thinking, but the silence of someone whose entire understanding of reality had just been shattered. When Clarissa finally spoke again, her voice was different, smaller, shakier. That's not possible. Natalie, someone made a mistake. $2 million for that old car? You must have misunderstood something. I have the documentation right here. Original purchase receipt, complete maintenance records, authentication certificate, current market appraisal. Everything is legitimate and verified. I need to see these papers. This doesn't make sense. Grandpa would have told us if the car was valuable. He would have mentioned it in the will or to the lawyer or... But even as she said it, I could hear her working through the implications. Grandpa had mentioned it in the will. He'd left the car specifically to me, with all related documentation. He knew exactly what he was doing. The car is being moved to secure storage on Wednesday. Climate-controlled, fully insured, 24-hour security. I'll be taking possession of all documentation and spare parts at that time. Wait, Clarissa said quickly. Don't do anything hasty. Maybe we should talk about this as a family. Maybe there are options we haven't considered. Options. Now there were options to consider. Now that the worthless junk had turned out to be worth more than everything else Grandpa had owned combined, suddenly my sister wanted to have family discussions. What kind of options? I asked, though I already knew where this was heading. Well, I mean, if the car really is that valuable, maybe it would make sense to sell it and split the proceeds. Keep things fair in the family. Fair. After a week of telling me to scrap it for parts, after years of mocking my dedication to both Grandpa and his car, after inheriting a house and investment portfolio worth hundreds of thousands of dollars while dismissing my inheritance as garbage, now Clarissa wanted to talk about fairness.
The car was left specifically to me, I said. All documentation shows clear ownership transfer. There's nothing to split. But Natalie, surely you can see how this looks. I mean, if we'd known the car was valuable, the will might have been written differently. Grandpa probably didn't realize what it was worth. The desperation in her voice was almost palpable. She was scrambling, trying to find some angle that would let her claim a piece of what she'd spent a week telling me to throw away. Actually, I said, I think Grandpa knew exactly what it was worth. The appraisal I found is dated 6 months ago. He had it professionally evaluated before he died. That final piece of information was the one that broke her, because it meant that everything, the will, the specific bequest to me, the careful documentation, had been intentional. Grandpa Theodore hadn't accidentally left me something valuable. He'd deliberately chosen to give the most precious thing he owned to the granddaughter who'd valued it when everyone else saw it as junk. The silence that followed was the sound of Clarissa finally understanding that her assumptions about worth, about value, and about who deserved what had been completely and catastrophically wrong. The phone call started at 6 a.m. on Tuesday. I was barely awake when my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. Clarissa told me about the car situation. We need to talk as a family. This affects everyone. By 7:30, I had 12 missed calls, 6 voicemails, and enough text messages to fill a small novel. The family crisis machine had been activated, and I was apparently the emergency they needed to manage. The first voicemail was from Dad, his voice carrying that stern, disappointed tone I'd heard throughout my childhood whenever I'd done something that didn't align with family expectations. Natalie, your mother and I have been talking with Clarissa about this car business. We think you're making some hasty decisions without considering the bigger picture. Call us back so we can discuss this rationally. Rationally. As if spending 7 years caring for Grandpa Theodore while everyone else pursued their own interests had been irrational. As if using my own money for medical bills had been some kind of emotional mistake that needed family intervention to correct. The second voicemail was from Benjamin, trying to sound casual but failing to hide his obvious concern. Hey, cousin, heard there might be some confusion about Grandpa's car. Just wanted to remind you that if you're thinking about selling it, family should get first dibs, right? Maybe we could work out something fair for everyone? Fair for everyone? Interesting how that phrase kept coming up now that the worthless junk had transformed into something valuable. Where had these concerns about fairness been when I was taking out student loans for medical bills? Where was the family solidarity when I chose community college over a prestigious university to stay close to Grandpa? But it was the third voicemail that really showed me what I was dealing with. Clarissa's voice, shaky and desperate in a way I'd never heard before. Nat, I've been up all night thinking about this, and I realize I may have been insensitive about the car situation. I was just trying to help you avoid getting taken advantage of by unscrupulous dealers, you know? But if it really is valuable, then we need to protect it properly. As a family, I think we should all sit down with a lawyer and make sure everything is handled correctly. A lawyer? Now she wanted lawyers involved. The same sister who'd been ready to have the car towed for scrap just 48 hours earlier was suddenly concerned about protecting family assets and ensuring proper legal procedures. I deleted all the voicemails without returning the calls and went to work at the library, where I spent the day researching Ferrari Dino sales records and auction results. What I found made my hands shake as I scrolled through page after page of completed sales. Cars in worse condition than Grandpa's had sold for over $2 million.
One with similar provenance and documentation had gone for $2.8 million at a Sotheby's auction in Monaco just 6 months ago. By the time I got home, there were 3 cars parked outside my apartment building. Mom and Dad's silver Honda, Clarissa and Bradley's white Range Rover, and Benjamin's blue pickup truck. They'd coordinated an intervention with what looked like a folder full of documents in Dad's hand. I sat in my own car for 10 minutes watching them through my windshield. They were standing in a tight circle near the building entrance, clearly planning their approach. This was the same family that couldn't be bothered to coordinate visits to see Grandpa in the hospital, but they'd managed to organize a same-day meeting to discuss my inheritance. When I finally got out of my car, they descended like a well-rehearsed negotiation team. "Sweetheart, we're just concerned that you might be getting overwhelmed by some big decisions. We want to help." "Help how?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Dad stepped forward with his folder. "We've been doing some research on vintage car markets, and we think you might be getting some inflated appraisals. The collector car business is full of people who take advantage of inexperienced sellers." Inexperienced sellers? Is that what I am?
Well, you have to admit, Nat, Clarissa jumped in, you don't exactly have experience with high-value transactions. This is complicated stuff. Tax implications, insurance requirements, market timing. It's not like buying parts for weekend repairs. Benjamin nodded earnestly. Plus, think about the pressure you'll be under once word gets out that you own something this valuable. People will be calling constantly, trying to lowball you or trick you into quick sales. I looked at the 4 of them standing there, united in their concern for my well-being, and felt something cold settle in my chest. For 7 years, not one of them had worried about the pressure I was under caring for an elderly man with a deteriorating heart condition. Not one of them had offered to help with medical bills or insurance requirements or the complicated decisions about his care. But now that there was money involved, suddenly I needed protection from my own inexperience. "So what are you suggesting?" I asked. Dad opened his folder and pulled out what looked like a legal document. "We've consulted with a lawyer about the best way to handle this situation. Given the complexity of the asset and the potential tax implications, we think the smartest approach would be to establish a family trust. That way, the car is professionally managed, properly insured, and when it's eventually sold, the proceeds can be distributed in a way that reflects everyone's connection to Grandpa." A family trust. They'd spent 1 day researching ways to get control of my inheritance and had already drawn up legal paperwork. "Everyone's connection to Grandpa," I said quietly. "Interesting. What exactly was your connection to him the last 5 years, Benjamin? How many times did you visit?" Benjamin flushed red. "That's not fair, Nat. I was finishing school, starting my career. I couldn't just drop everything like I did." "That's not what he meant," Mom interjected quickly. "We all loved Grandpa in our own ways. We all contributed to his care in different ways." "What ways?" The question came out sharper than I had intended. "What exactly did any of you contribute to his care?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Dad cleared his throat. "Natalie, this isn't about keeping score. This is about doing what's best for the family and honoring Grandpa's memory." "Grandpa's memory," I repeated. "The same grandfather who specifically left this car to me. The same car you all spent years telling me was worthless junk that I was wasting my time on." "We didn't know," Clarissa said, her voice taking on a pleading quality. "If we'd known it was valuable, we would have—" "You would have what? Treated it differently? Treated me differently? Suddenly developed an interest in Grandpa's passion project?" "This isn't about the past," Dad said firmly. "This is about making smart decisions going forward. The car is valuable, which means it needs to be handled properly. You can't just keep it in some storage unit and hope for the best." "Actually," I said, "that's exactly what I can do. The car belongs to me. The documentation is clear, the will is unambiguous, and tomorrow morning it's being moved to a secure facility where it will remain until I decide what to do with it." "Nat, please," Mom's voice cracked slightly, "don't let pride or hurt feelings make you do something you'll regret. We're your family. We love you.
We just want to help you make the best decision. That's when I realized what was really happening. They weren't concerned about my inexperience or my well-being. They were terrified that I might actually know what I was doing, that the granddaughter they dismissed as overly sentimental and financially naive might understand the value of what I'd inherited better than they did. You know what? I said, pulling out my phone and showing them the screen. I've already made my decision. The transport company will be here at 8 a.m. tomorrow to move the car to Westfield Classic Auto Storage. Climate-controlled, 24-hour security, full insurance coverage, everything is arranged and paid for. How much is that costing you? Bradley said, speaking up for the first time. Less than what I used to spend on Grandpa's medical bills, the bills I paid while all of you were building your careers and your lives and your futures. The folder in Dad's hand seemed to deflate. The family trust, the legal consultation, the coordinated intervention, none of it mattered because I wasn't the overwhelmed, inexperienced young woman they thought they were dealing with. This conversation is over, I said, walking toward my apartment building. The car was left to me, and I'm keeping it. If you want to maintain a relationship with me going forward, I suggest you find a way to accept that. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I could hear them having a heated, whispered conversation in the parking lot. But for the first time in my life, their disapproval didn't make me want to change my mind or seek their approval, because I finally understood what Grandpa Theodore was trying to teach me all those years. Sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones other people can't see the worth of. And sometimes the people who claim to love you only prove it when there's something in it for them.
Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that makes everything feel possible. I was awake before my alarm, dressed and ready by 7, standing in the driveway of what used to be Grandpa's house with a steaming cup of coffee and a folder containing every piece of documentation related to my Ferrari. The transport truck from Elite Classic Vehicle Services was due at 8 o'clock sharp, and I wanted to be there to oversee every moment of the process. What I didn't expect was to find the entire family already there when I arrived at 7:30. Clarissa's Range Rover was parked directly in front of the garage, positioned in a way that would make it difficult for a large transport truck to maneuver close to the building. Mom and Dad were standing near the garage door, both looking like they'd been there for a while. Benjamin was leaning against his pickup truck, phone in hand, clearly documenting everything for reasons I couldn't fathom. But it was the fifth person present who really caught my attention. A man in an expensive-looking navy suit, holding a briefcase and checking his watch with the air of someone who charges by the hour. "Natalie," Dad called out as I approached, his voice carrying forced cheerfulness. "Perfect timing. We wanted to be here to support you through this transition." "Support? Right. Who's your friend?" I asked, nodding toward the man in the suit. "This is Richard Pemberton," Clarissa said, stepping forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "He's a specialist in estate and inheritance law. We asked him to come take a look at the situation, just to make sure everything is being handled properly." Richard Pemberton extended his hand with professional politeness. "Ms. Cunningham, I understand you're moving a valuable asset today. Your family has expressed some concerns about proper procedures and documentation." I shook his hand, but kept my expression neutral. "What kind of concerns?" "Well," Pemberton consulted a notepad, "there are questions about whether proper estate taxes have been filed on an asset of this magnitude. There are also concerns about insurance liability during transport, and whether you have the appropriate permits for moving a vehicle of this value across state lines." Estate taxes? Insurance liability? Permits? They'd done their homework overnight, trying to find legal obstacles that might delay or complicate the car's removal. I had to admire their thoroughness, even as it confirmed everything I'd suspected about their motivations. "All taxes have been properly filed," I said calmly. "The estate was processed through Henderson and Associates, and all valuations were based on standard assessments at the time of probate. The insurance is current and comprehensive, and Elite Classic Vehicle Services is fully licensed and bonded for interstate transport." Pemberton made notes on his pad. "And you're certain the vehicle registration and title transfer have been completed according to state requirements?" "The vehicle registration has been in my name since the will was executed. All documentation was handled by the estate attorney." That's when Clarissa decided to play her final card. Actually, Nat, there's something we discovered last night that we need to discuss. She pulled out her own folder. This one's significantly thicker than mine. We found some discrepancies in Grandpa's estate documentation that might affect the validity of certain bequests. My coffee suddenly tasted bitter. What kind of discrepancies? Financial records showing that Grandpa may have been not entirely clear about his assets in the final years. Dad stepped forward, his voice taking on the gentle tone he used when delivering bad news. It appears he may have been suffering from some cognitive decline that affected his decision-making. Cognitive decline. They were questioning Grandpa's mental competency in his final years, trying to suggest that his decision to leave me the car had been the result of diminished capacity rather than deliberate choice. What financial records? Benjamin held up a stack of papers. Bank statements showing irregular withdrawals, unpaid bills, missed mortgage payments. Classic signs of someone who is losing track of their finances. I stared at the papers, feeling a cold rage building in my chest. Those irregular withdrawals were for medical expenses. The unpaid bills were because he was in the hospital. The missed mortgage payments were because he was focusing on staying alive rather than managing paperwork. That's exactly the point, Clarissa said gently, as if explaining something to a child. He wasn't capable of making complex financial decisions in his final months, which means the will might need to be reviewed by the probate court. Reviewed how? Pemberton cleared his throat. In cases where there are questions about testamentary capacity, the court can order a reevaluation of asset distribution, particularly when one bequest is significantly more valuable than others, suggesting possible undue influence or diminished judgment. Undue influence? They were accusing me of manipulating a dying old man into leaving me his most valuable possession, the granddaughter who'd spent 7 years caring for him, who'd taken out loans to pay his medical bills, who'd sacrificed her own future to ensure his comfort. I was being painted as the predator who had taken advantage of his weakness. "You have got to be kidding me," I said, my voice coming out sharper than I had intended. "Sweetheart," Mom stepped forward, reaching out as if to comfort me. "No one is accusing you of anything intentional. We know you loved Grandpa and wanted to help him, but sometimes when people are grieving and worried, they might say or do things that influence someone's decisions without meaning to."
What exactly are you claiming I did? We're not claiming anything, Dad said quickly. We're just suggesting that maybe Grandpa's decision to leave you the car wasn't based on a full understanding of its value. Maybe if he'd known it was worth millions, he would have made different arrangements. That's when I understood the full scope of their strategy. They weren't just trying to delay the car's removal or complicate the legal ownership. They were trying to invalidate the entire bequest by claiming that Grandpa Theodore hadn't been competent to make the decision in the first place. At exactly 8 o'clock, a massive truck with Elite Classic Vehicle Services emblazoned on the side turned into the driveway. The driver, a woman in her 50s with grease-stained coveralls and an air of complete professionalism, climbed down from the cab and surveyed the scene. "Miss Cunningham, I'm Sandra Chen from Elite. Ready to move your Dino?" "Actually," Pemberton stepped forward, "there may be some legal complications that need to be resolved before the vehicle can be transported." Sandra looked from Pemberton to me, clearly recognizing a family dispute when she saw one. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see proper authorization and documentation before I can proceed." I pulled out my folder and handed her the title, registration, insurance documents, and transport authorization. "Everything you need is right here." Sandra reviewed the paperwork carefully, then looked back at Pemberton. "Sir, unless you have a court order or legal injunction, I don't see any reason why this transport can't proceed as scheduled." "We're in the process of filing for a probate review," Clarissa said desperately. "Surely that creates some kind of hold on asset transfers?" "Not unless there's already a court order in place. The paperwork here shows clear ownership and proper authorization." That's when I made my decision. Looking directly at each member of my family, I spoke with a clarity that surprised even me. "Let me make something absolutely clear.
Grandpa Theodore was more mentally sharp in his final months than any of you have been in the past week. He knew exactly what he was doing when he left me this car, he knew its value, he knew its significance, and he knew that I was the only person in this family who would treat it with the respect it deserved. I paused, letting that sink in. The fact that all of you are standing here trying to invalidate his final wishes because you miscalculated the inheritance distribution tells me everything I need to know about your respect for his memory and your respect for me. I turned to Sandra. Please proceed with the transport. The car is in the garage, and I'll help you load it. As we walked toward the garage, I could hear frantic, whispered conversations behind me. Legal threats, promises of court challenges, accusations of selfishness and ingratitude. But for the first time in my life, their disapproval felt like validation rather than condemnation. Because I finally understood that some battles aren't worth winning if you have to become someone you don't respect to win them. And some victories only have meaning when you're willing to stand alone to achieve them. The Ferrari was going to its new home, and I was going to mine. The only difference was that now I knew exactly how much both were worth. 6 months later, I stood in the gleaming showroom of Barrett Jackson Auto Auction in Scottsdale, Arizona, watching as Lot 247, my 1973 Ferrari 246 GT Dino, slowly rotated on the presentation platform under spotlights that made the Rosso Corsa paint shimmer like liquid fire. The restoration had taken 4 months at Concourse Classic Restoration in Phoenix, and the result was breathtaking. Every piece of chrome gleamed, every leather surface was perfectly supple, and the engine, that magnificent Dino V6, purred with the precision of a Swiss watch. Ladies and gentlemen, we have here one of the most significant Ferraris to come to market this year. Lot 247, a 1973 Ferrari 246 GT Dino, numbers matching, complete documentation, recent concourse level restoration. This particular example has been in single-family ownership for over 50 years, with maintenance records dating back to the original purchase. The bidding started at $800,000 and climbed steadily. I watched from the VIP section, surrounded by serious collectors and automotive journalists, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and melancholy. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about honoring Grandpa Theodore's memory in a way that would have made him proud. We have 1.2 million, 1.4 million, looking for 1.6 million. My phone buzzed with a text message from Clarissa. It was the first communication I'd received from any family member since that morning in the driveway 6 months ago. Watching online, Dad says congratulations. We were wrong about the car's value. I deleted the message without responding. Too little, too late, and far too focused on the money rather than what it represented. We have 2.1 million, 2.3 million. We have 2.5 million from the gentleman in Section 4. The final hammer fell at $2.8 million, plus buyer's premium. After auction fees, restoration costs, and taxes, I would net approximately $2.4 million. More money than I'd ever imagined having. But that wasn't the real victory. The real victory was sitting in the front row of the auction audience.
Jessica Martinez was 24 years old, a former Air Force mechanic who'd spent 2 tours in Afghanistan, before coming home to find that her family had sold her grandfather's classic Mustang while she was deployed. She contacted me after seeing an article about my story in Automotive News, sharing her own experience of military service, family betrayal, and the heartbreak of losing something precious to people who couldn't see its value. Miss Cunningham, she'd written in her email, I know we're strangers, but reading about your grandfather's Ferrari made me think about my own situation. My grandfather left me his 1967 Mustang Fastback when he died, but my family sold it while I was overseas because they needed money for practical things. They got $8,000 for a car that was worth at least $60,000, maybe more. I've been trying to track it down ever since I got home, but it's like it vanished. I just wanted you to know that there are others of us out there, veterans who understand what it means to have something precious treated like junk by the people who are supposed to love us. That email had changed everything.
Instead of simply selling the Ferrari and moving on with my life, I'd started researching other cases of veterans whose families had dismissed or disposed of meaningful inheritances. What I found was heartbreaking and far more common than I'd expected. 3 months ago, I had established the Theodore Cunningham Foundation for Military Heritage Preservation. The mission was simple: help veterans and military families protect, restore, and preserve vehicles, motorcycles, and other mechanical inheritances that held emotional or historical significance. We provided grants for restoration work, legal assistance for inheritance disputes, and resources for tracking down family vehicles that had been sold without permission. Jessica's case became our first major success story. Using a portion of the Ferrari sale proceeds, we'd hired a private investigator who tracked down her grandfather's Mustang to a collector in Oregon. The current owner, once he learned the story, agreed to sell it back to Jessica at fair market value. The foundation covered the purchase price, and Jessica got her grandfather's car back. $2.8 million, Jessica said as we walked out of the auction hall together. That's incredible, Miss Cunningham. Think about how many families we can help with resources like that. Call me Natalie, I said, smiling at her enthusiasm. And you're right, we can do a lot of good with this money. The foundation had already received over 200 applications for assistance. Stories of vintage motorcycles sold for scrap, classic cars traded for practical family vehicles, antique tractors hauled away as junk while the owners served overseas. Each case represented someone like Jessica, someone like me. People who'd served their country only to come home and discovered that their families had treated their most precious possessions as inconveniences to be disposed of. But it wasn't just about the vehicles. It was about respect, about understanding that value comes in many forms and that some things are worth preserving regardless of their market price. What's next? Jessica asked as we reached the parking lot. Well, I said, pulling out my phone to show her our latest case, we just got contacted by a Navy veteran in Maine whose family scrapped his grandfather's 1942 Indian motorcycle while he was deployed. The motorcycle was one of only 500 ever made for military use during World War II. Probably irreplaceable, but we're going to try to track down the parts and see if we can rebuild it. Jessica's eyes lit up. That sounds amazing. How can I help? 6 months ago, I had been the disappointing granddaughter whose inheritance was dismissed as junk. Now, I was running a foundation that had helped 12 veteran families recover or restore meaningful vehicles, with enough resources to help dozens more. The Ferrari money would fund operations for years, but more importantly, Grandpa Theodore's legacy was helping other families understand what he'd tried to teach mine, that the most valuable things aren't always the most obvious ones. My phone rang as we reached my car, a practical Honda Civic that I'd bought with my first foundation salary. It was Dr. Whitfield from Hartwell Automotive Authentication. Natalie, congratulations on the sale. I watched the auction online. $2.8 million is a fantastic result. Thank you, Dr. Whitfield. I couldn't have done it without your expertise. Actually, that's why I'm calling. I've been thinking about your foundation work, and I'd like to offer our authentication services at cost for any vehicles you're helping to restore. Proper documentation can make a huge difference in both preservation and value. After I hung up, Jessica looked at me with curiosity. You seem happy, but also, I don't know, peaceful. Like you found something you were looking for. I thought about that as we drove through the Arizona desert, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. 6 months ago, I was fighting for respect from people who would never give it. Now, I was working with people who understood what respect actually meant. I think, I said finally, I've learned that the best revenge isn't proving people wrong about you. It's becoming someone who doesn't need their approval in the first place. The Theodore Cunningham Foundation operated out of a modest office in downtown Millbrook, just 3 blocks from the library where I used to work. Every morning, I walked past the building where Grandpa had lived his final years, past the garage where we'd spent countless hours working on a car that everyone thought was worthless.
But now, I knew better. The car had never been worthless. It had just been waiting for the right moment to reveal its true value, and for the right person to understand what that value really meant. Sometimes the most precious things are the ones that teach us who we really are when everything else is stripped away. And sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is the chance to prove that their faith in you was justified, even when everyone else thought they were wrong. Grandpa Theodore had given me both. And now, every day, I was passing those gifts on to others who needed to remember that their sacrifices mattered, their service had value, and their stories deserved to be preserved. That was worth more than any amount of money. That was priceless. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.